The stack of hundreds sat on the table like a heavy green brick. $10,000 meant to buy my soul, but all I could focus on was the small red dot dancing across his heart. Thorn Ezekiel Crow stared at me, his eyes hooded and dangerous, his tattooed fingers splayed over the cash as if waiting for me to snatch it. He looked like a man who believed every person had a price, his expensive suit and heavy watch a testament to a life built on buying and selling lives. Around us, the night market was a symphony of chaos, the sizzle of street food, the glow of paper lanterns, and the thick, humid air of the city. But at this table, under the colorful awnings, the air was cold and brittle. Beside him, Arden Noel Blackwood leaned back in her navy dress, her smartphone clutched in a manicured hand. She looked at me with a visible sneer of disgust, as if I were a common thief for even hesitating. She wanted me to take the money and walk away. She needed me to be gone before the trigger was pulled. 30 minutes ago, I was just a waitress trying to survive a double shift. I had been clearing empties near the shadow of the back alley when I heard her voice, sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of the love she performed in the light. I had frozen behind a stack of crates, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The signal is sent," she had whispered into her phone, her back to the market. "He's sitting at the center table. The clear shot is from the rooftop across the square. Don't wait for dessert. Do it while the crowd is at its peak." I should have kept walking. I should have taken the $10,000 tip Thorn just shoved toward me and disappeared into the city, leaving the monster to his fate. Instead, I stood there, my hand shaking, as I ignored the money. I leaned in closer, my shadow falling over the stack of bills, my wide-eyed gaze locked onto Thorn's shocked expression. "Keep your money, Mr. Crow," I whispered, my voice thick with an urgency that silenced the table. "Because if you don't move in the next 5 seconds, you won't be alive to spend it." The silence at the table was sudden and absolute, a sharp blade cutting through the humid chaos of the night market. Thorn Ezekiel Crow didn't move, but his eyes narrowed, turning into chips of dark obsidian that seemed to calculate my worth in a single, freezing glance. The $10,000 stack, a green brick of false security, remained untouched between us, an insult to a man who believed every soul had a price tag. Beside him, Arden Noel Blackwood's sneer deepened, her fingers tightening around her smartphone as a flicker of genuine fury crossed her face. "You're making a mistake, girl," Thorn said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory frequency that vibrated against the crystal glassware. He pushed the money an inch closer, his tattooed knuckles white under the lantern light. "Take the tip. Walk away. People who refuse my generosity don't usually live long enough to regret it." I didn't flinch, though my heart was hammering against my ribs with enough force to crack bone. I leaned in, my apron brushing the edge of the table, bringing my face inches from his. The scent of expensive cologne, tobacco, and the approaching copper tang of blood filled my senses. "Keep your money, Mr. Crow," I whispered, the words sharp and urgent as a razor wire. I didn't look at Arden, but I felt her posture stiffen into stone. "Use it to pay for your funeral, or listen to me and live." His jaw tightened, a small tell that meant he finally realized this wasn't a negotiation. I gestured with the smallest movement of my chin toward his chest, where the tiny red dot of light was now centered over his heart like a burning coal. "Look down," I commanded, my voice a ghost of a sound that barely carried over the sizzle of the nearby stalls. Thorn's gaze dropped. For a beat, time seemed to freeze. He saw it, the lethal promise of a sniper already in position. Beside him, Arden made a sudden, mechanical movement to reach for her bag, her facade of love finally splintering into jagged pieces. 45 seconds, I breathed, echoing the countdown that was now screaming in my head. "If we're still sitting here when the jazz quartet starts the next bridge, you're a dead man. Now stand up and act like you're furious with my service." Thorn Ezekiel Crow, a man carved from marble and violence, didn't argue. He stood in one fluid movement, his hand slamming onto the table with theatrical rage, sending the whiskey glass clattering to the floor. "You spilled the drink on a suit that costs more than your life," he roared for the benefit of the watching crowd, his hand gripping my arm like a vice. He yanked me forward, and I stumbled, the terror in my eyes finally real enough to hide the plan. We moved toward the shadows of the alley, leaving the money, the betrayal, and the red dot behind us in the golden light. Thorn's grip on my arm was a brand of iron as he dragged me into the darkness of the wet alley, the roar of his staged fury still echoing through the market stalls. Behind us, the golden glow of the lanterns was swallowed by the shadows of the city. We moved fast, our shoes skidding on the slick, refuse-strewn pavement as the first crack of a suppressed rifle shattered a nearby ceramic pot. Thorn didn't flinch. His movements were surgical, a predator who had spent a lifetime turning violence into a choreographed dance. "Left," he barked, shoving me past a row of steaming industrial vents that hissed like cornered vipers. I risked a glance back toward the table we had just abandoned. Through the haze of charcoal smoke and the frantic movements of the crowd, I saw Arden. She wasn't running in terror like the other diners. She was standing perfectly still, silhouetted against the vibrant market lights, her smartphone pressed to her ear as she directed the shadow figures closing in on our position. "She's not running," I whispered, my breath hitching as we ducked behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. "She's watching us." Thorn pulled me flat against the cold brick wall, his chest heaving against mine in the narrow space. In the dim crimson of an overhead emergency light, his face looked as though it had been carved from obsidian, sharp, angular, and suddenly ancient with the weight of realization. He didn't look like a man mourning a lost love. He looked like a king watching his own crown being melted down for scrap. "It wasn't just the money," he murmured, his voice a low, jagged rasp that vibrated through my own skin. "I checked the accounts. She's had enough offshore to disappear 10 times over." He reached for a small black pistol hidden at his ankle, his tattooed fingers moving with a terrifying mechanical grace. "I taught her how to spot a weakness. I taught her how to wait for the perfect moment to strike when a man feels most secure. She didn't sell me out for a payday, Alara. She sold me out for the seat. She wants the empire I built, and she's using the very tactics I carved into her mind to take it." The realization seemed to settle over him like a burial shroud, turning his initial shock into a cold, lethal pragmatism. He wasn't just fighting a traitor, he was fighting his own legacy. The labyrinth of the city's underbelly opened up before us. A world of damp concrete and forgotten corners that Thorn's luxury sedans usually bypassed. He moved with a heavy, restless energy, his hand still tight on my arm, as if he expected the brick walls to collapse in on him. To him, these were just transit points for product and muscle, but to me, they were home. I led him deeper into the guts of the South Side, weaving through the steam of laundry vents and past the low, flickering neon of storefronts that had long ago given up on the American dream. "We can't stay on the main vein," I whispered, pulling him into a narrow passage that smelled of wood smoke and cheap soap. "The cameras there belong to Arden now. In here, the only eyes that matter are the ones she doesn't know exist." We burst through a heavy steel door into the back of St. Jude's soup kitchen. The air inside was thick and humid, smelling of starch and industrial-strength cleaner. A dozen men and women sat at long plastic tables, their heads bowed over steaming bowls. As we entered, the room didn't tense up the way Thorn's boardrooms did. Instead, a soft murmur of recognition rippled through the space. "Ilara?" A man with a weathered face and a tattered coat looked up, his eyes widening as they landed on Thorn's blood-spattered white shirt and visible tattoos. "You okay, kid?" "I'm fine, Silas," I said, my voice finally finding a steady anchor. "Just passing through. We need the basement exit to the 42nd Street line." Thorn stood in the center of the linoleum floor, a displaced god in a Tom Ford suit, looking at the cracked ceiling and the chipped ceramic mugs with a mixture of bewilderment and disdain. He was a man who measured his territory by the acre, yet here, in a room that cost less than his watch, he was the outsider. He watched as a woman in a stained apron handed me a clean rag for the cut on my arm, without me even asking. "You're a queen of nothing," Thorn murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the clatter of spoons. He looked at Silas, then back at me, his brow furrowing as he realized no one was cowering. "They don't fear you. Why do they move for you?" "Because I've spent 3 years holding their hands while they died in the ward," I replied, pushing him toward the cellar stairs. "They don't move for me because I own them, Thorn. They move for me because I'm one of them, something your money forgot how to buy." I saw the flicker of something new in his obsidian eyes, not suspicion, but a disorienting sense of displacement. For the first time, the Mafia boss was walking a path he couldn't pave with gold. Thorn sat on a crate of industrial canned goods, his Tom Ford suit ruined by the grime of the soup kitchen basement. The adrenaline of the chase had faded into a cold, heavy silence that felt more oppressive than the snipers outside. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring, the metal catching the dim light of a flickering bulb. He held it out, the gesture as mechanical as a business transaction. "The cash is back at the market," he said, his voice regaining that low, commanding frequency. "But this ring, it's worth more than that stack of hundreds. It's your down payment, for getting me this far, for being the variable I didn't see coming." I looked at the gold, then back at the man who thought everything in the world was just a debt waiting to be settled. I didn't reach for it. My hands, still stained with the ballpoint ink of the warning I'd written, remained at my sides. "Put it away, Thorn," I said softly, my voice steady despite the chaos of the night. He frowned, a microscopic crack appearing in his obsidian mask. "I don't like being in debt to people I don't own, Alara. Everyone has a price. Is it the hospital bills? Your father's care? I can make the debt vanish with a single phone call." I took a step closer, the damp concrete floor cold beneath my feet. "That's where you're wrong. You think you can buy my yes because you've spent your whole life buying silence and loyalty, but you can't buy what's already been paid for." Thorn leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he calculated my words like a predatory rhythm. "What are you talking about?" "I told you I was a nursing student, but I didn't tell you why I do this. My yes isn't for sale to you or Arden, because I've already been bought with a price by a higher king. My life isn't my own to sell for $10,000 or a gold ring. I saved you because mercy is a command, not a commodity." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of a bomb waiting to detonate, but the silence of a man who had suddenly realized he was holding currency that was no longer valid. He looked at the ring, then at me, and for the first time, the Mafia boss looked truly impoverished. He realized that while he owned the city, he couldn't own the girl standing in front of him. Thorn let the gold ring slip back into his pocket, his gaze shifting to the jagged ink that climbed from beneath his collar and spilled across the backs of his hands. The basement of the soup kitchen was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city above us. He began to unbutton his cuffs, rolling the sleeves of his ruined white shirt back with a slow, deliberate gravity. Each movement felt like he was peeling away a layer of armor he had worn since childhood. He pointed to a crown of thorns wrapped around his right wrist, the lines faded but deep. "I got this the first time I killed to protect my father's territory," he murmured, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "And this one," he gestured to a serpent coiling up his forearm, its fangs bared near his elbow, "marks the night I took the seat for myself. Every mark is a boundary, a warning, a piece of a war that never ends." He looked at his hands as if they were weapons he no longer knew how to holster. To him, his skin was a map of every sin he had committed and every betrayal he had survived. It was a history of violence rendered in permanent black ink, a story that only ended in a grave. I stepped closer, reaching out to trace the edge of the serpent tattoo, my touch feather-light against his skin. He tensed, his pulse drumming a rapid, predatory rhythm beneath my fingertips, but he didn't pull away. "You see them as scars of a soldier," I said softly, looking up into his obsidian eyes, which were no longer cold but fractured with a strange, new vulnerability. "You see a history of blood, but scars don't just tell the story of the wound, Thorn. They tell the story of the healing." I moved my hand to the crown of thorns on his wrist, the skin there calloused and hard. "These marks prove you survived the war. They don't have to be signs of the monster you were forced to be. They can be the marks of a man who is still here, a survivor who has been given a second chance to change the narrative. The ink is permanent, but the person underneath it isn't." For a long beat, Thorn stayed perfectly still, his breath hitching as he looked at his own arms, as if seeing them for the first time through a mirror that didn't reflect a predator. The silence was no longer heavy with the threat of death, but with the terrifying weight of hope. He realized that the marks of his past didn't have to dictate his future. They were merely the starting point for a transformation he had never dared to imagine. The heavy steel door of the basement groaned open, and the cold, clinical click of stilettos on concrete shattered the fragile silence. Arden Noel Blackwood stepped into the dim light, flanked by 4 men whose silenced pistols were leveled with lethal precision at Thorn's head. She looked radiant in her navy dress, her smartphone now tucked away, replaced by a gaze that was calculating and hollow. Thorn didn't move. He sat on the crate, his rolled-up sleeves revealing the ink we had just discussed, looking like a king awaiting his sentence. "Ilara, honey," Arden said, her voice dripping with a poisonous maternal sweetness. "You've done a remarkable job keeping him alive, truly, but let's stop playing house in a soup kitchen." She took a step closer, the gold jewelry at her throat catching the flickering light. Thorn's hand tensed near his ankle, but the sight of the 4 red laser dots now converging on his chest froze him in place. "I know Thorn tried to buy you," Arden continued, glancing dismissively at the ruined suit and the humble surroundings. "I know he offered you a pittance to play the hero, but Thorn is a relic. He thinks in thousands, I think in territories. I'm offering you half of the docks, half of the distribution, a seat at the table where the world is actually run. All you have to do is step aside and let my men finish what should have happened at the market." The men shifted, their eyes darting between me and Arden, their expressions reflecting a world where such an offer was impossible to refuse. To them, the Empire was the ultimate prize, the only god worth serving. They waited for the snag, the negotiation, the inevitable yes. I looked at Arden, then at Thorn, who was watching me with a dark, expectant stillness. I felt the weight of the moment, the same pressure that had been in the night market when the $10,000 sat like a brick on the table. "You really don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with a clarity that made Arden's smile falter. "You think the only reason I haven't taken his money is because I was waiting for more of yours. But your empire is just a high-priced cage. I already told him, and now I'm telling you. I've been bought with a price you can't match. I won't trade a man's life for a seat at a table of ghosts." The room fell into a vacuum of silence, so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked out. Arden blinked, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. She looked at her men, seeking a shared understanding of this madness, but they only looked back with wide, uncertain eyes. For the first time, the greedy were silenced, confronted by a value system they couldn't parse. I hadn't just refused her gold, I had rendered it worthless. Arden's confusion curdled into a cold, lethal impatience, her hand signaling the men to tighten the circle. The red laser dots danced across Thorne's chest, steadying as they prepared for the final command. The soup kitchen, a place built on the quiet dignity of service, was seconds away from being painted in the violence of a throne room coup. Thorne looked at me, and for the first time, the predatory rhythm in his eyes was gone, replaced by a clarity that was terrifyingly calm. He saw the way I stood my ground, a waitress with no weapon but a no that had brought 2 empires to their knees. My faith wasn't just a shield, it was a mirror, and in it, Thorne Ezekiel Crow finally saw the man he was meant to be before the world taught him to be a monster. He stood up from the crate, his movement slow and deliberate, his empty hands raised not in surrender, but in a final, sovereign choice. He stepped past me, putting his broad shoulders between the snipers and the kitchen staff who huddled in the shadows. He was no longer hiding, he was offering. "Lower the guns, Arden," Thorne said, his voice a low, resonant bell that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor. "This neighborhood isn't your battlefield. These people have nothing to do with our war." Arden laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You think you're in a position to negotiate? You're a dead man walking, Thorne." "Then kill me," he replied, taking another step forward until the barrel of the lead assassin's gun was pressed against the white silk of his shirt, right over his heart. "But do it outside. If a single drop of blood hits this floor, or if you touch a soul in this building, you'll never sit in my chair. The families won't follow a queen who brings a massacre to a soup kitchen. They'll see you for what you are, a common butcher." He looked back at me, a microscopic smile touching his lips, a silent acknowledgement that he had finally understood what it meant to be bought with a price. He wasn't trying to buy his life anymore. He was modeling the sacrificial love he had seen in me. By offering himself up, he was stripping Arden of her only leverage. Arden's eyes darted around the room, seeing the silent, judgmental gazes of the people Thorne had once ignored. The power was shifting, not through lead or gold, but through a radical vulnerability she couldn't conquer. Thorne walked toward the exit, leading the wolves away from the fold, transforming his execution into an act of protection. The cold morning air of the alley bit into us as Thorne stepped into the center of the concrete stage, surrounded by Arden's strike team. The red laser dots remained fixed on him, but the atmosphere had shifted from a hunt to a standoff. Arden followed us out, her face twisted in a mask of frustrated triumph, her heels clicking like a death march on the pavement. She looked at her men, her voice a sharp, jagged command. "What are you waiting for? He's standing right there. End it!" But the lead assassin, a man whose neck was marked with the same serpent ink as Thorne's, hesitated. He looked at Thorne, not at the Mafia boss he had served for a decade, but at the man who had just walked into a gun to protect a room full of strangers. The violence that had always been their language suddenly felt like a broken dialect. Thorne didn't reach for the pistol at his ankle. He simply stood there, his empty palms open, his gaze steady and devoid of the predatory fire that had once defined him. "I'm done, Leo," Thorne said softly, his voice carrying over the distant hum of the city. "The war is over, not because she won, but because I'm not fighting it anymore. If you want to kill me for a seat at a table that's already crumbling, do it, but know that you're killing the only man who would have died for you." Leo's finger rested on the trigger, but his hand began to tremble. Behind him, the other 3 men lowered their sights, the red laser dots disappearing from Thorne's white shirt one by one. They weren't looking at Arden anymore. They were looking at a leader who had found a purpose higher than survival. One by one, the silenced pistols clattered onto the wet asphalt. "You fools!" Arden screamed, her voice reaching a frantic, hysterical pitch. "I am the one paying you. I am the new head of the family." "There is no family left to lead, Arden," Leo said, his voice heavy with a new kind of conviction as he unpinned his tactical badge and let it fall. "We were loyal to a ghost. This man, he's something else." The kingdom of fear, built on decades of blood and bought loyalty, collapsed in that damp alley not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of weapons hitting the ground. Thorne's men didn't defect to a new boss. They simply walked away from the darkness, moved by a radical sacrifice they couldn't ignore. Arden stood alone in the center of the alley, her gold and her smartphone powerless against the silent, crushing weight of a changed heart. The empire hadn't been conquered, it had been surrendered. The heavy, suffocating weight of the empire had finally lifted, replaced by the crisp, biting clarity of a Chicago winter that no longer felt like a burial shroud. The night market hummed with a different frequency now, not the low, predatory rhythm of stolen wealth, but the vibrant, chaotic symphony of a community coming back to life. Thorne Ezekiel Crow stood by the same table where the $10,000 had once sat like a green brick of judgment, but his hands were no longer splayed over cash. They were holding a blueprint for the market's new medical clinic. His expensive Tom Ford suit had been traded for a simple wool coat, and though the ink still climbed his neck, the serpent and the thorns looked less like warnings and more like the honest history of a man who had survived the dark to find the dawn. I stood beside him, no longer just the invisible waitress who had overheard a murder plot in a wine cellar, but a partner in a restoration that money alone could never have funded. Thorne looked out at the rows of vendors and the families laughing under the paper lanterns, his obsidian eyes reflecting the light instead of swallowing it. He had spent a lifetime measuring his worth in leverage and risk, but as he watched a young girl run past with a sparkler, he finally understood the math of mercy. "I used to think owning the city meant controlling its breath," Thorne murmured, his voice a low vibration that held no trace of the old violence. "I didn't realize I was the one suffocating until you refused to be bought." I reached out, my fingers brushing the scars on his wrist, marks that no longer signaled a war, but a testimony. "You weren't bought with a price you could pay, Thorne. You were saved to serve." The gilded lotus and the concrete fortresses were ghosts of a past life. In their place stood a man who used his resources to mend what he had once helped break. We weren't a mafia boss and his captive anymore. We were two survivors walking a narrow path together. As the jazz quartet began a new soulful bridge, Thorne didn't look for snipers or red dots. He looked at me, and in that gaze, I saw a kingdom built on restoration rather than ruin. The note I had slipped him a year ago had changed his world, but his choice to stay changed mine. Together we watched the snow fall, covering the old blood in a blanket of white, making everything, finally, look clean and new.